Throughout the book of 2 Kings, the writer rates each of the kings. And the typical formula is King so-and-so was blank years old when he began to reign. He reigned blank years, or in some case months, over Jerusalem. His mother was so-and-so, daughter of so-and-so. And then comes the rating, whether the king did what was evil in the sight of the Lord or did what was right in the sight of the Lord. Well, the vast majority of kings did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Amon, who was Josiah's father, reigned only 2 years, and the writer says he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Josiah's grandfather was Manasseh, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he was probably Judah's worst king. Unfortunately, he reigned for 55 years. Well, the reason each king, he was such a bad king in the judgment of the writer of 2 Kings, was that he followed the abominable practices of the nations. He rebuilt the high places, in other words, places to worship other than Jerusalem. He erected altars to Baal and reinstituted worship of all the fertility gods. And then he built altars to various gods right in the temple, which was the house of God, and he misled the people to do evil. So when Josiah discovered the book of the law and realized how far they had gone from God's laws and God's ways and purposes, how far away they were living, he came to a time of repentance. And it's not simply repentance as we tend to think about repentance as feeling sorry. It's repentance in its true biblical sense. Repentance as turning around 180 degrees, turning around to face God and changing the way the people were living. That's what Josiah's reforms were all about. Turning from worshiping other gods to worshiping the one true God and destroying the high places and the altars to the Baals. Turning from living however they wanted to live to turning and following God's laws. Turning from disregard for the covenant that God had established and turning around to live out the covenant. Turning from their current way of life and living as God would have them live. Well, with all of that, of course, the writer of 2 Kings would rate Josiah as he did what was right in the sight of the Lord and walked in all the way of his father David. He did not turn aside to the right or to the left. Josiah was one of the best kings of Judah, and the reading today holds up this picture of this great leader and this great king. Well, as I said with the children, today is Christ the King Sunday. It's the last Sunday of the church year, and it is the day that we celebrate Jesus as King over us, over all the world, and over the universe. And even as 2 Kings paints a really good picture of Josiah as a great king, one of the greatest kings in the history of Judah, and who walked in the ways of the Lord, Christ the King Sunday paints an even more powerful picture of what it means to be king and a picture of an ideal king. When I think of Christ the King Sunday, I often think of the Gospel of John and John's understanding of who Jesus is. As John tells the story of Jesus' crucifixion, it's a very different story from Matthew, Mark, or Luke. In Matthew and in Mark, we get a picture of a suffering Jesus, a Jesus who is too weak to carry his own cross, so Simon of Cyrene has to carry it. And the only thing Jesus says on the cross in Matthew and Mark is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And Jesus dies alone and abandoned, and it feels like a tragedy. Luke has a very similar picture. Again, he's too weak to carry his own cross, But you don't get this intense picture of suffering. He doesn't say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Instead, he asks God to forgive those who have crucified him, and he tells the thief dying on the cross next to him, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." And as he dies, he commends his spirit to God his Father. But there's still a sense of tragedy. But John's picture is totally and completely different. For John, this is Jesus' hour. It's what he's come here to do. And rather than a tragedy, John pictures the crucifixion as the coronation of a king. The throne is a cross, and the crown is a crown of thorns. And Jesus, not the soldiers, is in control. In John, Jesus carries his own cross. The sign on the cross says, "The King of the Jews," and it's written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, so everyone can read it and understand it. He is surrounded by his disciples and the women, and he takes great care for his mother as he's dying on the cross. And when everything is accomplished, when everything is finished for salvation, he triumphantly shouts, "It is finished," and he willingly dies. You see, Christ the King Sunday is about Christ, the ideal king. A king who dies for the sake of his people, a king who takes on the role of a servant and washes his people's feet and serves his people, a king who deals in forgiveness rather than put-downs or condemnation, a king who loves and cares for his people like a shepherd caring for sheep, a king who is about building up rather than tearing down, a king who is about kindness and mercy rather than bullying and retribution. Christ the King Sunday lifts up Jesus as an example and model of what it means to be king. And it is a completely different way of being king and leader. So, if Christ is truly king, if he is the ideal king that we proclaim that he is, what does that mean for how we live out our lives? If Christ is truly king, what does it mean for how we spend our time and our resources? If Christ is truly king, what does it mean for how we live in the world and with our neighbors, whoever our neighbors might be, and whatever our neighbors might look like? See, Christ the King Sunday is incredibly comforting on one hand because it proclaims that God reigns and that God is in charge. But on the other hand, Christ the King Sunday is incredibly challenging. Because if Christ is our king as we proclaim, then it influences and impacts how we live, the decisions we make, how we relate to others and treat others and the planet on which we live, and ultimately how we follow and serve God. Which brings me back to Josiah. Josiah's reign as king brought about repentance and lots of changes. They got rid of the idols, they tore down the altars to Baal, they ended idol worship and went back to worshiping God. But the problem is that even though the people of Judah repented and changed directions, they fell right back into the old patterns of worshiping other gods. And so God allows Babylon to come in and destroy the kingdom of Judah and to carry the people off into exile. And we're left with the question, what's God going to do with the people who in the end can't serve God? And that brings us to Advent. Amen.